remember it. And I think that's how learners might work as well. If you tell them in a story, they might remember it, they might link to it, they might relate to it. Without giving a lot away, I don't want to speak, I don't want to give everything away about the session, but my name is Sarish, and I'm the marketing manager at McGraw Hill, and I'm your moderator for today, along with my colleague, Rachel. And we're here in the background to help you and support you. If you have any questions or if you're facing any technical difficulties, please let us know. We're happy to support you in the background. We want to keep this session as interactive as possible, and we want to keep it chat going. We want to keep it engaged. So feel free to use the chat box to interact with the presenter. Equally, you can use the Q&A box to ask any questions, and we're happy to take them up towards the end of the session. So use the Q&A box if you have any questions during the session, and I'm happy to moderate and we can ask them towards the end, or use the chat box to interact. Moving on, I am very, very excited to have Jamie Keddy with us today. Jamie Keddy, sorry about that. For us today. He's a teacher, trainer, and author, and a storyteller. That's why I'm very excited about this session, because it's all about stories and storytelling, which is really the essence of life. Jamie, for those of us who don't know you, because I think you're new to our region, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
It would be a pleasure, and thank you very much, Sarish. I'm honoured to have you as my moderator. Thank you very much. Everything in moderation, including me. So you've got a very important role today. And yes, it's lovely to be with you today. And just if you don't know me, I have been to some of the countries that are being represented today. So it's possible I've met some of you before. Who's to say? If you've not met me before, then let me tell you 5 things about myself. And the first thing is, well, everybody's saying where in the world we are. I am in Barcelona. That's Barcelona behind me. Behind behind that wall anyway is a very busy Barcelona street. The street on which I live. And that's the first thing. The second thing is what I do. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher trainer. I'm also a teacher, but I'm more a teacher trainer these days. And as has been said, I'm a storyteller. The third thing, let me just get my slides up here. A quick question for Sarish and Rachel. When you give when presenters usually slides, do they usually take away the image and put themselves on it, like I'm doing right here? Is that?
Oh, it's fantastic! Wow,
I don't know if that was the idea, but that's what I did.
Now.
It did now. So that's me with my arms. If you ever wonder what I look like with my arms crossed, that's it. That's it, with a black shirt. I have the third thing about me is I run an online community of teachers and an online course. Oops, that's not what I wanted to show you. That I was going to tell you actually that that's it there. That's my online community of teachers and my course. This is called Lesson Stream. And there's my online course, Lesson Stream Story course. The fourth thing is, I was going to ask you to guess where I'm from. The answer is Scotland. And the fifth thing is, although I am Scottish, technically, I've only ever worn a kilt once in my life. And that's it right now. This is the only time I've ever worn a kilt in my life. And it was during my graduation, 1994. A long, long time ago. Some of you weren't even born. Looking at you, Sari. Is that right? And I studied biochemistry. That's me holding the diploma in my hand there. It's not really the diploma. It's a plastic tube that's supposed to be out. Everybody knows that. You never carry around your diploma on the day you graduate, do you? And if you do, you certainly don't roll it up into a tube. That would be a terrible thing to do. So as soon as that photograph was taken, the tube was taken away from me. It's all a big lie, isn't it? I wondered actually if I should have used that picture in my first slide. I don't know what you think of that, but then I thought, no, I'll just go with this one right here. And yes, so this is an introduction in really, because what you see here is it's a story. This is a story, isn't it? This is, I just told you the story of the day that, it wasn't a very remarkable story, the day that this photograph was taken and they gave me a plastic tube. That's my recollection of this photograph being taken from my parents. This photograph hangs on their wall at home in Scotland as a reminder of the day that their eldest son graduated. I suppose it reminds them about their eldest son, that they have a son, because I live in Barcelona, they live in Scotland, and without this photograph, who's to say they might forget me? You know, and so this is an example of an unremarkable story, but which is very meaningful to me, very meaningful to my parents. And I think that this is where we start the session today, because, you know, we all know, don't we, that human beings are made of protein and lipids, or fat if you prefer, and lots of water. But also we've got to remember that we're also made of stories. We are, as I sometimes say, as I often say, creatures of narrative, creatures of narrative. And as human beings, you know, stories are, it's very complicated actually, how many stories we're made of, and how many stories we are, how many stories we are subjected to on a daily basis. I mean, stories are, I mean, in a sense, it doesn't sound very romantic to say this, but stories are tools, you know, and here's some of the things that we use stories for. We use stories to understand the world, stories to understand each other, stories to strengthen relationships, stories to persuade, stories to sell, stories to communicate, stories to entertain. Let's just look at a couple of these. I mean, I'd like to know about your context. Who do you teach? Who do you teach? Do any of you teach English for specific purposes, academic purposes, for example? Who do you teach? What's your teaching context? Let's have a look. Eyes on the chat here. Whoops. You know, after all these years of using Zoom, I'm still takes me ages to get used to it. So English for academic purposes, English as a foreign language, Arabic as a foreign language, EFL. So I mean, you know, if we're teaching standard English, you know, when I'm thinking of specifically what the session about today is, you know, stories from the teacher. You as teachers using your own stories. And another day we could talk about stories from students, but today it's about stories from teachers, academic. And I suppose then the most obvious tool, the most obvious way then that we would use our stories for in the classroom is as a source of language. You know, a story from the teacher is just a text. It's an embodied text. And lots of teachers have different ways to approach it, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about mine. But, you know, English for academic purposes, some teachers might think, well, there's no room for storytelling in teaching for academic purposes. I would say absolutely yes, there is. You know, if you're looking at, let's say, you know, academic purposes, you know, if I've been teaching English as an academic purpose, I think back to my days as a biochemist. You know, I just showed you my graduation picture, didn't I? And I actually studied science. I studied science, biochemistry, almost forgetting because it was so long ago. And, you know, back then things were a bit dry when it came to presenting your research results. You know, you're expected to stand up there and talk data. That's what people expected. That's what we did. But really, you know, 30 years later, scientists, and those of you who teach academic purposes will probably know this, that scientists are being told and taught and trained to communicate their research findings, let's say, using story. Tell us the story of the research you're going to present. Why did you choose it, or why did it choose you? What's your interest in it? You know, tell us about the narrative of the research and what you did, your experimentation, your thesis. Tell us about the conflicts. Tell us about the problems that you had to overcome. And this is using story arcs to present something which is otherwise can be quite dull. Figures are never particularly interesting, the way that I was told all those years ago to present them. So story and storytelling are very important. And I think that if we want, as is the case here, our students to be the storytellers, we have to show them storytelling in action. We have to lead by example. We have to give them a model. And you, the teacher, are the best model in the classrooms. There's so many different ways to do this. You know, story from the teacher can provide a model, a communicative situation that is communicating through stories so students get it and then they see how to do it themselves. So whatever your context is as a teacher, and I actually say this when I'm giving this session to any communicators, because I do this session or sessions like this to business people as well, and all sorts of communicators. My number one piece of advice is collect your stories. You know, if you work in business, the stories that are going to be useful for you are going to be very different to the stories that are useful for you as a teacher. I've got a question for you. Oh, and Asia says discourse analysis. My goodness, it's impossible to teach discourse analysis without looking at story. I mean, context and situation, providing a context and providing a situation always requires a story, doesn't it? Context and story are inextricably linked, and story and context are a very important part of discourse analysis. Let me ask you all a question here, and all I want you to do is type yes or no, or anything in between if you like, into the chat. And this is a key question here. Do you consider yourselves to be storytellers in the classroom? Do you consider yourself to be a storyteller in the classroom? We've got a yes, we've got a no, we've got a yes, we've got another yes, we've got lots of yeses, one no there. This looks to me that the yeses are favouring the balance here. Harry, hello, Harry's a sometimes. Kahiba is a sometimes. We've got Natasha's answer is my favourite so far, and absolutely. Fatima, yes. Maniza, apologies if my pronunciation is not good here, is an often, yes. So I mean, sometimes we have to really, define this though, because a story. I used to have a teacher at school who told us lots of stories when I was a teenager, and we never warmed to him. The problem is that he was trying to show off to us, and his stories were too long, and he was posturing. He was trying to kind of demonstrate to us that he was actually one of us. He was trying to say, look, guys, this is how cool I am. And it just did not work. So it's no good just saying we should tell stories to our students. And I'm going to just demonstrate a few principles. So I want to tell you a few stories here and demonstrate what I mean when I talk about teacher-led storytelling. And I mentioned that my number one piece of advice to you, absolutely number one, is to collect your stories. And I use a notes app here. I use notes. I have an Apple phone, a very old phone actually. It's all smashed. I need a new one. And I might even buy one of these days. But let me just read to you some of the stories from my notes. And these are stories that I've collected. I have hundreds of stories. And okay, let me just read some kind of summaries or titles here. Number one, the story about the time I got bitten on the ankle by a little vicious dog in the street. This is true. I was bitten on the ankle by a little vicious dog, and upon complaining to the little vicious dog's owner, I was called a liar. Yep, that actually happened on the way to work, so that was a great story to be able to use in class that day. the story about a teacher friend of mine who moved to Thailand, didn't have a bank account and was paid in cash. And he decided that the safest place for him to keep his cash was in the freezer compartment of his fridge. He thought this was a good idea. It turned out to be a very bad idea. That's the gist of the story. Maybe I should tell you why, just to be fair to you. The place he was living, they all had a cleaner, you see, and the cleaner, well, one day the electricity, there was a power cut, and he was away, you see, and the cleaner cleaned out the fridge and threw everything away, including all of his cash. So that's what happened. The story of my invisible cake mistake. Actually, I'm going to tell you this story because I like this one. And this is an example of a story I've told to many students here. And I want you to imagine this. I want you to picture the scene. 5-year-old Jamie. This must be 1977. And I'm standing in the middle of the room. And I'm standing with my classmate. I can still remember her name. Her name is Mandy. And around us in a circle are all of our other classmates. And I'm holding in my hands, I'm holding a cake. It's not a real cake, it's an imaginary cake. And the drama teacher who's standing outside the circle, the drama teacher says to Mandy, Mandy, ask Jamie where he got the cake. This is the drama teacher trying to drive the narrative. So Mandy says to me, where did you get the cake, Jamie? That's a 5-year-old little girl's Scottish accent. And I said, I got it from the butcher's shop. And this caused everybody in the classroom, all of my classmates and Mandy, just to start laughing at me. And everybody was laughing at me because I thought that I'd got this cake, this imaginary cake from the butcher's shop. But then the drama teacher stepped into the circle and she actually was not laughing. And I looked up at the drama teacher thinking, oh, she's not laughing. This is good. And she said to her, what's so funny about that? Jamie got the cake from the butchers. What's so funny about that? And one of my other classmates said, because you don't get cakes from butchers. and the drama teacher said, where do you get cakes from? And the classmate said, from the bakers. And the drama teacher said, well, that's often the case. You're absolutely right. We usually do get cakes from the bakers, but not in this case. Am I right, Jamie? I had no idea what she was talking about. She said, no, in this case, Jamie got the cake from the bakers because the baker's wife, Jamie got the cake from the butchers because the butcher's wife is an excellent baker and she left the cake with the butcher for Jamie to pick up. Isn't that right, Jamie? I just went. And the laughter stopped and nothing else was ever said of this cake confusion. And then we just got on with it. And I'll always love my teacher, my drama teacher, for saving my life on that day. That's the story of Jamie's invisible cake. And I've used this story a lot, not just in teaching, but also in teacher training. I mentioned that stories can be tools. And I find this to be quite a valuable tool for illustrating a very important point in drama or in improv. I don't know if you know what this is called. It's called the yes and principle, where what we have to do is we have to accept an answer that a student gives, and without saying it's wrong, if it's a content-related answer rather than a language-related answer, this is without saying it's wrong, build it into the narrative. It comes from the world of drama. It comes from the world of improvisation, where you have to build on everybody's ideas, accept everything and go with them and never say no. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes as teachers, this can be a very valuable thing for the classroom. And if I'm doing what I call teacher-led storytelling, this is an example of a story that I like to tell. So that's Mustafas is an anecdote rather than a story. Yes, anecdotes are types of stories, for example. So it's interesting, maybe this is not quite the type of story you're expecting to hear. I'm not sure, maybe it is. But yes, I am very much talking about life stories. And often I really try to encourage teachers who are using stories to try to find the stories from our lives which are unremarkable and yet meaningful, because that's what we are as story creatures. We become aware of those experiences in our lives, those experiences and those stories, which are not necessarily remarkable. They can be unremarkable, but they're very much meaningful. You've just got to give them shape. You've got to prepare them. And so here, the next follow-up could be to ask students to identify a teacher from their childhood that they remember, a teacher who did something meaningful, who saved them, just as my drama teacher did to me that day. I'll never remember, I don't remember her name, but I'll always love her for doing that. Let me just show you a couple of things. See, a few more from my list. Jamie's big London disappointment, a story about a mini success that I had when learning French at school, which turned out to be a failure in disguise. The time that I won, or rather I failed, I should say, at paraphrasing, but won the banter. I love this story because it puts myself into a communicative situation as a learner of Spanish. And I had to deal with a situation, and I can simulate the same situation for my students. Now, all of you, I'm going to assume, have learned a second language. For some of you, that second language will be English. And think of all those times when you had to use English. Think of all those times when it was a failure. That might be a very, very valuable situation. And go back and contextualize it. What was the situation? What did you have to do? Who did you have to communicate with? Then give students that situation, then ask them how they would deal with it. What would they say, for example? And then you can say what happened to you. It's a very standard format I like to use. Let me give you one more quick story here. I mentioned, this is a story I may have mentioned, and this is a list. It begins with a list, and the list here is Madame Tussauds and the Waxworks Museum in London. And the second thing in the list is the mummies at the British Museum in London. The next thing in the list is Superman 2, a movie, Superman 2. And the last thing in the list down there in the bottom right is the Tower of London, where people used to get their heads cut off. So these are the 4 items on my list. Number 1, Madame Tussauds, the Waxworks Museum. I wonder if you know that. Number 2 is Superman. Number 3 is the Egyptian mummies at the British Museum. And number 4 is the Tower of London, where people used to have their heads cut off. Now, what do these lists, or what is this list? What is it all about? Can you make sense of this list? As a storyteller, I love to find opportunities to incorporate lists into stories because they can be just so interactive. What is this list all about? I can ask my students. I could even dictate this list because there's some nice grammar there, isn't there? The Tower of London, where people used to have their heads cut off. There's a used to there. What do you think this list is all about? Let me just go back to your chat here. Landmarks in London, touristic places. Exactly. So let me just tell you this quick story. And this, again, this is a story let me just tell you, in fact, before I tell you the story, let me tell you how this story came to be. I was teaching with a course book, and the unit in the course book was London. It seems there was a time where every course book had a unit on London, you see. And the very first thing that we had to do, or I should say students had to do, was this little match of different London landmarks. They had to match the landmarks with the text. So A matched with 1, and what you get the idea, you know. And so that I thought, you know, why not, rather than just asking students to go to page 42 and do this little vocabulary match, why not tell them a very quick story? And somebody said that these were London landmarks, and you're absolutely right. Now, I'm from Scotland, as I mentioned before, and I didn't actually visit London until I was about 12 years old, and this was a big experience for me. So I'm 12 years old, and I'm on a train with my mother and my little sister, and we're going from Edinburgh to London, and I am really excited. And on the train down from Edinburgh to London, we made a list of all the things we were going to do. And the list was go to Madame Tussauds the Wax Museum, go to see the Tower of London where people used to get their heads chopped off, go to see the mummies, the Egyptian mummies at the British Museum, and go to see Superman 2 at the cinema. The film had just come out. Great structure there. The film had just come out, but unfortunately you could only see it in London, so it was not in Scotland yet. And by the way, if I'm telling a story, I might pause at any time to write a structure like that on the board. The film had just come out. Superman 2 had just come out, but unfortunately it was only being shown in London. What a great piece of language, don't you think? You can do this if you're telling a story. You can pause to draw attention to a phrase that the students are going to meet sometime or already have met in their course book. So those are the 4 things that I remember from the list. But the thing that I wanted to do more than anything else was not on the list. And by the way, I could ask my students, put up your hands. Who's been to London? What did you do in London? Did you enjoy it? Those who have never been to London, what would you like to be? What would be on your list? So it can be very interactive here. And now I'm asking you a guessing question. What do you think 12-year-old Jamie wanted to do in London more than anything else? The thing that was not on the list. Any ideas? What was that thing? The London Eye. That's funny because people sometimes say that. And the funny thing about that is that the London Eye was not there when I was 12 years old. The London Eye is quite a recent addition. Go to see a football match, says Wayne. That's a good idea, but 12-year-old Jamie was not actually a football fan. I became a football fan in my later years. I watched last night the Champions League semi-final, but when I was 12 years old, football did not interest me. Go to see Big Ben. Let me tell you, these are great ideas. The thing that I wanted to do more than anything, the thing I was so excited about, was to go on the London Underground. I mean, it was just the idea for 12-year-old Jamie was the most exciting idea. You couldn't believe it. The idea of going under the ground. Just imagine you're on a train going under the ground. There was a part of me that actually didn't believe that such a thing even existed. It's a fiction. It couldn't possibly be true. I had all these questions, how are we going to get down there? Will it be dangerous? Will we have to wear special helmets with torches? Of course, the London Underground existed, but not how I'd imagined it. I was very disappointed. I remember my mum saying, well, Jamie, what did you expect? And I said, well, I expected when I was on the train to see more out of the window. My mum said, oh, for goodness sake, Jamie, we were under the ground. What could you possibly have expected to see out of the window? And of course, your mum's always right, isn't she? I just kept quiet. I didn't answer her. I didn't say, for example, that I'd been expecting to see, for example, buried treasure, giant dinosaur bones and giant burrowing worms going through the earth and molten lava. I didn't mention that I'd been expecting or hoping to see any of these things. The title of this story is Jamie's Mum is Always Right. Or maybe it could be called Jamie's Big London disappointment. You can ask your students to give the story a title. The alternative title was that Superman 2 was great. So an alternative title for the story was Saved by Superman. So, you know, there's so much we can do here with that story. That story takes 5 minutes to tell. It's interactive. You can get students speaking through it, guessing what the list has in common, asking them what they would do if they went to London, what they did if they ever went to London, did they enjoy it, you know. And then there's the short story. And this is a way into the course book topic. Now, as teachers, I'm going to guess, and you can tell me if you're wrong, that sometimes when you want to introduce a course book topic, you might look for a YouTube video. Am I right? I know this because I've been working with teachers using video and image and story for 15 years. And I happen to know that a lot of teachers I work with will turn to YouTube to look for a short video to introduce a topic. Now, if that's you, then you must stop doing this. It's one of the worst things that we can do. It's teachers, we've been led to believe, it's almost like we've been brainwashed that we should not speak, that we should not tell stories, that telling stories is teacher-centered. Let's say you can find a short story, which is a short video, which is 2 or 3 minutes long to introduce a topic. Why would you source your job to YouTube? Why would you not find a personal story of your own, which is going to be much more meaningful, much more memorable, and is going to be a text, a spoken text? Why would you not share a story of your own to introduce a topic? So stories, we mentioned stories are tools. One of the things that we can use a story for is to introduce a topic. It's a classic way to introduce a topic. I used to have a teacher at school who always did this, and her classes were some of the most memorable classes that I ever experienced in my life. She would always introduce a topic with her stories. You know, no matter what the topic is, you can find a story. That's the challenge. That's the challenge. Any questions, by the way? If anybody's asked a question so far, I missed it. So please ask it again. I really like this chat going on while we're doing this. So if anyone's got any questions at this stage, please ask them now. I always prefer questions as we're going along rather than saving them up until the end. And now going back to this list here, there's a question. There's a story here called Frankie 1, Students 0. So yes, feel free. I've got my eyes on the chat, and this is an example of what I sometimes refer to as a story item. A story item is a key thing, maybe a person or an object or a place or an utterance from a story, which gives students a clue about the story and allows you to ask them, what do you think happened? So you can give students a story item or a set of story items and ask them to guess what happens in the story. In this case, the story item is the title. And the title is Frankie 1, Students 0. And I like that title because it gives rise to questions. Who is Frankie? Obviously, there was a game here. It's like a sports competition, a football match. Frankie won, Students lost. What went on? So there's all sorts of questions could come from your students. Fotini asks, would you use a story that may be current to your students? Absolutely, absolutely. I absolutely do, yes. And the story I'm about to tell you, Frankie 1, Students 0, has often been a story that my students have particularly liked. And I'm going to ask you some questions, by the way, after this story. I'm going to ask you some comprehension questions. So maybe I could say, listen carefully. Frankie 1, Students 0. Okay, so can teacher use a story from students' lives? I'm happy, let's just answer these before we go on. I mean, that might be difficult because it all depends if A, you know the story from your students' lives, or B, if your student is happy for you to do it. But sometimes, some things I've enjoyed doing as a storytelling teacher, and this is a lot of fun. If you experience this, you know, as a teacher and your students, you experience things together. You know, I remember once, I remember experiences that we've had together as a teacher and students. For example, that time that your student arrived late, you asked your student, what's your excuse? And your student had something really funny to say. And because it was so funny, you decided to let the student off. What if you prepared a little text that told that story? Do you remember that time when, and you tell the story a few weeks later? So you can use shared classroom experiences and give them shape, turn them into a text and use those texts. Those will be very, very meaningful. So there's absolutely yes. And Oeba says that, but vocabulary of the stories, should it be relevant to level? Yes, you've got to remember that stories like this are just texts. And when we're preparing texts, and that's the key, another key takeaway, there's two things I want you to take away here. The first thing, I've said it already, is collect your stories. And the second thing is develop your stories, prepare your stories. If you're planning to use a story in the classroom, think about the text, give it some shape, think very hard about your language choices, because any given story can be graded. It can be graded for A2, it can be graded for B1. So that's a great story there, a great question there. Thank you. And by the way, the idea here, if your stories are unremarkable, but yet meaningful, you can find stories of your own within my stories. I'm sure you could find a story about the trip to London, sometime you went somewhere, or time when you were disappointed, a story about a teacher. And in this case, I'm going to tell you another story about a teacher. Frankie 1, students 0. Here's the story. Now, when I was at school, I don't know what you think about this, but sometimes we used to play tricks on our teacher. I wonder if that's something you used to do when you were at school, or something that your students do to you now. I don't mean anything really bad, just little practical jokes, little tricks on our teachers. Let me give you one example. One example is we like to leave notes on our teachers' desks. And the great thing about this is there's no way the teacher would ever know who did it. So, the idea, we'd write a note, a little note, we'd fold it up, leave it on the teacher's desk. And what we would want is the teacher would notice the note during class, pick it up, unfold it, read the note. And then we, want some kind of reaction. And then we would all have to try not to laugh. I don't know what you think of that. But let me tell you the best note, the best note that we ever left. The best note we ever left was, and I think this is quite genius. It said, there is a piece of cheese on the classroom ceiling. So you understand the idea here. There is a piece of cheese on the classroom ceiling. More often than not, the teacher did not see the note, but it happened to, what we really wanted here was for the teacher to see this note placed strategically in the middle of their desk, think, what's this? Pick it up, unfold it, and read this note. There is a piece of cheese on the classroom ceiling, and then look up to try to find that fictitious piece of cheese that obviously was not there. And when the teacher started doing this, that was just hilarious. And we would, as I said, have to try not to laugh, because if you laughed, you might demonstrate that you were involved in this joke, and then you could get into trouble. If you could keep a straight face, the teacher didn't know it was you that left the note, which makes it quite ingenious in my mind, don't you think? So we played this in a few teachers, and I think we maybe caught out maybe 2 teachers in a few weeks, but I'll never forget the day that we played this trick, or tried to play this trick, on our history teacher. His name was Mr. Francis. And Francis was, Frankie, I should say, as we called him, was one of the coolest teachers I've ever had in my life. And, you know, it was about 5 minutes from the end of class. And we were starting to think that he wasn't going to notice the note because he hadn't seen it, he hadn't picked it up. 5 minutes left. But then with about maybe just 2 minutes left, he noticed the note and he stopped talking. And he picked it up and he scrutinized it. And then he unfolded it and he read the note. And then, as cool as a cucumber, he walked over to the corner of the room and he crumpled up the note and he dropped it into the bin. And his eyes stayed level and he came back to the class and he looked at us and he said to us, I know there is. It was me who put it there. And every single one of us in the class, we all looked up. Frankie won, students nil. So that's my story. Frankie won, students nil. And I've got this story for you. If you would like to use this story with your students, you're welcome to do so. It's a very short text. It's a very simple text. There's a lot that we can do with it. And you can say it happened to a friend of yours, or you can just tell your students it happened to you. No problem. Maybe it can become an urban legend. I don't know. But I said I was going to ask you some comprehension questions. I'm going to ask you some comprehension questions right now. And I would be interested to know right now, what kind of comprehension question are you expecting me to ask? Is it, for example, the question, did you visualize? Did you visualize a piece of cheese on the classroom ceiling? And if you did, what kind of cheese was it? And how was it stuck to the ceiling? Was it stuck with sellotape or staples or maybe even glue? And how did you imagine me back in those days? How did you imagine Mr. Francis, the history teacher? Did he have a beard, a big beard? Was he bald, perhaps? Did you wonder, did you put yourself in this situation? Did you imagine how you yourself would deal with this situation if you were a teacher and your students played this trick on you? Did you maybe ask yourself that question? Did you wonder, this is a good question, did you wonder where this story was going? Did you ever think, I wonder where this story is going? I wonder how this story is going to end? That's a really, really standard question to ask, isn't it? That's one we can exploit as teachers. We can ask students to predict what's going to happen. What else could I ask? Did you wonder, I wonder if this story is true, or at least is it all true? I wonder if Jamie changed any of the details. Did you judge me? Did you think, Jamie playing tricks on his teacher, that's a bad thing to do? Did you think about a time when maybe you played a trick on somebody or somebody played a trick on you, not necessarily a student? Oh, there goes my light in the dark now. Did you take anything away from this story? For example, did you think that maybe Mr. Francis was able to do what he did, maybe because he had learned what we were doing in the staff room? Maybe other teachers were sharing their experiences and telling each other what was going on. So maybe he was actually expecting this. Maybe he was cheating. Maybe he knew this was coming. And if so, maybe this is an illustration of the importance of sharing information with each other in the classroom. So those are what I would refer to as comprehension questions. Those are comprehension questions. And I think that we, as language teachers and as a profession, we often think of comprehension, or we conflate comprehension, we confuse comprehension with understanding. Understanding is often, it's convergent. we have to come together on certain things. We have to come together on cause and effect, for example. We have to come together on agreement of the meaning of specific words. We have to come together on things which are right and things which are wrong, not from a subjective point of view, but from an objective point of view. Let me give you an example here. If somebody tells you a joke, you either get it or you don't. That's understanding. That's understanding the joke. And to an extent, a lot of this is also about comprehension, convergent comprehension. But comprehension is also divergent. You know, it's subjective. If we define comprehension as making meaning, then so much of that meaning that we make is divergent, it's personal, it's opinion, it's interpretation, it's visualization. It's all these things that we do in an active way when we consume the story. There's no such thing as active listening. There's no such thing as active reading. Reading and listening are highly active cognitive processes. Making meaning is to work hard here. And so those questions that I just asked you are great examples of divergent comprehension questions. And these are questions that I would like to ask students after I've told them a story. They can read these questions on their own, then they can compare and share their answers with each other. And what you're doing here is you're really getting students to personalize the story. So although the story was told by you, the teacher, although it's your experience or it's your story, really at this stage, your students are making personalized meanings from it and finding their own stories within it. This is a really standard way as a teacher I like to use story in the classroom if we've got a bit more time to do so. If we're wanting to have a nice, maybe a Friday afternoon, I say Friday afternoon because Saturday's my day off, for you maybe a Thursday afternoon, activity. So this is divergent comprehension questions. Now, I've got one more example, sorry, one more activity for you. Let me just see if anyone's got any questions here. Have I missed any questions? I've tried to keep my eye on the chat, but getting older and being
Jamie,
male.
I can help. There are a few questions that have come in the chat if you want me to read
yes,
them.
please. Yes, please.
So Adil says, teacher gives the title of the story and then lets the learner guess about the story. Does this work effectively? Oh,
yeah. I mean, really, I refer to this on my course as a story priming technique. And I think that storytellers, but when we're looking at storytelling as a craft, as a performance, if you're a storyteller, as I do, I tell storytelling in events, almost like stand-up comedy. What you need is a way-in. You're looking for a way-in, and it's sometimes difficult to find a way-in. As teachers, if we want to share a story in a classroom, what we can use is a story priming technique as our way-in. And the way-in I gave you was to give the title, Frankie 1, Students 0. Say, students, I'm going to tell you a story. This is the title. What do you think happens in this story? What is it about? That's just one example of a story priming activity. And I'm going to show you another example of a story priming activity in just a moment. There are other example story priming activities that I could give you. For example, I could ask a question. Like, for example, I'm going to tell you a short story in a moment, but before I do, imagine you're going on a trip to London. I want you to make a list of all the things that you would like to do. All right, 10 things that you would like to do in London. So that's a question which is obviously thematic, which connects the story I told you before. How about the invisible cake? The invisible cake. I could say, imagine this, everybody. I'm standing in the middle of the room and I'm holding an invisible cake. What's going on? Can you, I'm not saying that's the best idea, but that's an example of a story priming technique. So that's a great question. I hope that answers the question that was asked. Any more questions?
Yes, there's one by Gul Bahur. It says, do you always tell the real stories, or can you make it up to match the purpose of the telling that story?
No, I don't always tell my own stories. Sometimes I tell other people's stories. For example, the story of a teacher friend of mine who lost his money when he kept it in the freezer. But also, sometimes I will take a story and I'll tell the story as if it's my own. For example, there's one that I'm very fond of. It's an incident that happened at a wedding, a terrible, terrible thing, which is on one hand quite terrible. On the other hand, it's very, very funny and it's almost unbelievable. And after telling my students that story, I say, you know what? I have to tell you something. That story may or may not be true. And then that really gets your students' attention. And say, okay, listen, I'm going to tell you the story again. This time, listen very carefully, and you've got to decide if this story is true or false. So I've never, ever experienced that not engaging students. Students sit on their seats. They want to hear the story again. They scrutinize you, the teacher. They are detectives. And then they can interrogate you. They can ask you anything they want. And you've got to put on your best performance, your best Oscar-winning performance. And in my case, I got the story from a very quick viral video on YouTube, which is where I'm just describing what happens. And by the way, I'm going to tell you a little secret here. The story of Frankie 1, Students 0, it is based on a true experience that I had. And it's also, another teacher told me a similar experience. And what I've done is I've married the two stories to give it shape. And so technically, it's actually a fiction, although it's born out of two true life experiences. And I had a teacher called Frankie, so he was real. And this is exactly the sort of thing that he would do. So if I'm ever telling that story to my students, as far as they're concerned, it's true. I don't know what you think about the ethics of this. That's up to you. But I'm going to give you that story, Frankie 1, Students 0, and you can use it yourself, and you can tell your students it happened to you if you want. It's up to you. Does that answer that question? Any more questions here?
Lots of them, and we just got like a few minutes left. How long should a story be to be engaging?
That's a great story. And as a storyteller, I mentioned I do storytelling events, and some of my stories, I think the longest story I've got as a storyteller, as a performer storyteller, that is, the longest story I've got is about 30 minutes. However, as a teacher, I would never even think about using a 30-minute story in a classroom unless it was serialized. As far as I'm concerned, the answer to that question is the shorter, the better. Now, because, I'm always looking for ways to make my stories interactive, because as I mentioned, listening is actually an active process. There's no such thing as passive listening. But we know that teachers, we want to use our stories to get students doing stuff. So speaking, for example, before or after the story, stopping halfway. There's so many things that we can use a story to get students doing stuff. So let's say I might have a story which is only 3 minutes long. That's a great 5 minutes maximum. Let's say I don't want my stories to be any more than 5 minutes, but 2 or 3 minutes. And that often shatters the image that a lot of teachers have when we talk about teacher-led storytelling. I'm not talking about talking for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes to a group of silent students. I'm talking about using a story as a text. And if you see the story of Frankie 1, Students 0 written down, it's actually a very short text. And anything that you can do with that story, you can do with a text, or I should say it the other way around. Anything you can do with a text, you can do with that story, but much more. Great question. Any more questions?
I think we'll just take one, Jamie, if that's fine. I know we're off
Sure
time and there were
thing.
a couple of them. We couldn't answer all of them, and I apologize for that. All great questions. We'll try to get back to them maybe after the session as a follow-up. But would you explain briefly how can the teachers teach a certain grammatical point through a story?
I mean, yeah, it's actually not difficult at all. There's lots and lots of different ways. If you start to collect your stories, you'll see that there are, you know, if we say a story is just a text, it's the same question. How do you find a text to illustrate a grammar point? Some grammar points come up again and again and again in stories, like aspect, the difference between the present simple, the present continuous, past simple, past continuous. Some, on the other hand, you might just be looking for a single good example of a grammatical structure in a story. So, for example, that might be an infinitive of purpose. And when we look at very, very short stories, we can, I mean, I'm thinking, okay, let's say if I was to teach used to, let's say, used to, and I could go back to the story of Jamie visiting London, I would focus on that one. I would say I could find more ways. Okay, the Tower of London, where people used to get their heads chopped off. I would say, you know, back in those days, when new films came out, they didn't used to show them in the whole country. They just used to show them in London first. And let's see, what else could I say? Yeah, the London Eye didn't used to exist back in those days, although that's a bit of a false example. But give me a bit more time, I could find more opportunities to put used to in that text. There's no quick fix, there's no quick answer I can give you to that. You just have to be a bit creative as the teacher. Change your mindset a little bit as well. I think I don't have any problem with having one single good example in a story to teach language. Let me give you one more quick example. When I'm teaching although, when I have to teach although, my favorite example is, although Jamie is Scottish, he has only worn a kilt once in his life. I've got lots of stories for teaching present perfect. So it's about, I'll go back to what I said before. Collect your stories, develop your stories, become aware of the potential for each stories, and that means become aware of the grammar potential that your stories have. What language can your stories illustrate? When you start doing this, your stories become your best lesson plans. You could go into any class, you could be thrown into it without any preparation, and you'd know that that 2-minute story could be used for a 60-minute activity. That's what I'm very interested in doing. Just to show you very, very quickly. Oh, actually, just let me show you something very quickly here. And hi, Rachel. How are you? You pop back up.
I'm still here, enjoying every minute.
Can I just? I had a little gift to give everybody. Can I just show people, give people this gift? I've got a little gift for you, and it is a little ebook. And the ebook is it's called 10 Ways to Use Story in the Classroom. I'm just going to 10 Ways to Use Story in the Classroom. Can you see this? That's what it looks like. And in this little ebook, 10 Ways to Use Stories in the Classroom, the story of Frankie 1, Students Nil, is in this ebook. So I'm going to drop the link into the chat, and all you have to do is give me your email address, and you'll be signed up also for my newsletter, which I call the Lesson Stream Post, which is I send out weekly story ideas to a few thousand teachers. So I've sent the landing page, I've dropped that into the chat. How are you, Rachel?
Good, Jamie. All the better for having listened to an hour about storytelling. Very, very good, very informative, very useful. Great session. Absolutely great.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Our pleasure.
I just want to remind everyone for the email addresses that are popping in the chat, you'll have to sign up on the link that's there. So I've sent it again to everyone. Please sign and receive the ebook. So if you would like to receive the ebook, you will have to go on the link. Right? So sending it again in the chat. And thank you so much, Jamie. Honestly, what a great session. So nice to have you on our webinar. Honestly, thank you so much for your time. This was really like enlightening for me.
Oh, great. If anyone's got any questions, I'm very, very easy to find. Very easy. Just go to lessonstream.com or lessonstream on Instagram. Send me a text, find my email. I'm very, very happy to answer all questions that I get. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. It's been a pleasure to work with you. Some great questions. Thank you to McGraw Hill for putting this together. And lovely to meet you, Serish. And thank you for all your emailing, Rachel. Been great.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for a lovely session. Bye for now.
Bye. And I'm just dropping the email address. If you have any questions, you can email us at marketing.mea. That's marketing.mea@mheducation.com. Any questions, feel free to email us and we can get back to you. I'm dropping the link again. I think a couple of you are asking for the link to get the ebook, so I'm going to drop that in a second. There's so many people saying thank you. You're very welcome. Until next time, I guess, for our next ELT webinar, but here's the link. You can get the ebook. Thanks again, Jamie, and thank you, Rachel. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.